NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
My name is Monica Reed. I serve as the Director of Advocacy here at NACDL. So I have the pleasure of introducing our next panel and our moderator for today's panel. We met, I guess, through mutual acquaintances, and we've been kind of working with them and Heartland Alliance for the last couple of months and some work around ending permanent punishment. So I'm very glad to have this next person moderating this panel, which is Quintin Williams. He is the campaign manager for Fully Free, the campaign to end permanent punishments at Heartland Alliance in Chicago, Illinois. And it will be him that will be introducing and moderating the panel on parole and probation reform.
All right, thank you, Monica. And I certainly appreciate all of the support that you've given to the Fully Free campaign. It certainly means a lot. Thank you all for joining us for this very important panel. As Monica mentioned, I am the campaign manager for Fully Free, the campaign to end permanent punishments. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what are permanent punishments? And I think it's very appropriate for this panel because we call permanent punishments what most folks know as collateral consequences. And we use that language very intentionally because the notion of collateral, there's nothing collateral about laws and statutes and administrative codes that bar people from critical resources, but then also how it's felt by individuals with records. I talked to many individuals with records in the Chicagoland area, and they all spoke about this idea of permanency that the criminal record has on individuals. And Fully Free seeks to abolish what I call the prison after the prison. What we're going to talk about today is probation and parole reform. Because sometimes folks think that probation and parole is something that is markedly better than being confined, but oftentimes probation and parole can be just another more subtle form of confinement and also trip people up in their road to becoming more fully integrated into society. So thank you all for being here with this most important conversation. We're going to have today speaking to you all in order, LaTonya Tate, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Alabama Justice Initiative. We have Stephen Munkelt, Executive Director of California Attorneys for Criminal Justice, and then Jessica Jackson Sloan, Chief Advocacy Officer of the Reform Alliance. Really incredible lineup here. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I'll be moderating this panel. I'll be asking each one of our panelists just one sort of guiding question that I think really encapsulates the work that they do. And they will be giving you different perspectives from different angles of experiences with the probation and the parole system. So first we have LaTonya Tate. And LaTonya, you are a former probation and parole officer. And, you know, can you just, for the people, shed some light on what it is like to work on the front lines of probation and parole, but also, you know, your own direct experiences with family, and how you are now using those experiences to empower formerly incarcerated individuals.
Certainly. Hey, and thanks you all for having me join this panel. I feel like I'm sitting on, you know, the shoulders of some giants, and thank Angela Frazier Giles for inviting me here, and good to sit with Jessica. We've been, you know, meaning to get together for a long time, and Stephen, it's a pleasure to meet you. But what brings me to this work, and I can certainly talk about my tenure with the Florida Department of Corrections as a PO. as you know, you all may know, and some may not know, that I'm the mother of a formerly incarcerated son who was sentenced to a 20-year prison sentence at the age of 19 in the state of Alabama for robbery one, which robbery carries 20 years to life in Alabama. So he was given a 20-year prison sentence, and it was during that time I was in the medical field, and my whole career transitioned from medical to, where I am today with criminal justice degree with a master's and two masters with a master's in public administration and policy with an emphasis in government and policy. So it was during that time I had taken a job as a PO working on the front line, the only African-American female in a small town in Florida called Defuniak Springs. It's in a county called Walton County. So I relate that because a lot of people don't know where that is. I tell people, if you've ever been to Destin, Florida, that county is called Walton County. So you go straight through the Defuniak to get to the beach. So I had the opportunity and the pleasure to, take the role as being a PO, as Florida does not have parole because they abolished parole, but we still supervise people that were on parole. So it gave me an opportunity to really just dig deep. And from my own experience, my son was sitting in prison during that time frame. And I supervised, my caseload was probably 95% Caucasian people. So what I did, I challenged that experience based off of what I was facing as a mother that had a son sitting in the Alabama prison, and none of my colleagues understood why I came into the office and just started shaping things into more like a reentry role. But that was based off of my experience with my son being in prison. So I was like, I would want someone to treat my son right when he get out, and he's going to be on parole coming out of prison in Alabama. So it gave me an opportunity to those that I was supervising to really just dig deep and find out, why are we sending so many people back to jail for technical violations, testing positive for drugs? Why isn't it something that we need to be doing differently? So what I learned is in Florida, they have 67 counties and they have a judicial preference list. And it was, using the judicial preference list, I can easily send that person back in front of the judge and just do a violation report without a warrant. That means keep them in the community, but add a condition that they must, especially if they was, smoking like drugs or something, submit to a substance abuse and any treatment that's deemed necessary. So I was doing, that phase of advocating. I became the prison liaison for the prison, where I went to the prison and talked to people about reentering, those that had probation to follow, even those that were coming out on parole. And also, it was during that time when reentry was peaking, and I put on the biggest reentry fair in the state of Florida that it just modeled throughout, the state of Florida. So it was during that phase as I got down to the root of what was transpiring with people, because I felt no one is born to be a criminal. What is really happening in these individual lives, So, being an officer, you have the PSI, so you have a pre-sentence investigation of most people, and you're able to, find out the demographic information. Are these are these generational people? Have their parents been on probation? And that's what I learned, POing. So it just gave me a sense and a direction to lean more, into reentry and find out what can we really be doing to add best practices to accommodate individuals that are on supervision besides, putting them in jail. And I tell people when I talk about this all the time, the easiest thing for a person that's supervising people that's on supervision is called easy case management. That means if a person tests positive for drugs or not following any of the conditions that they're supposed to be following, the easiest thing for an officer to do is put you in jail. That takes you off the caseload. You're in jail. You're being, they don't have to be bothered with you anymore. So that experience sparked me when my son went back to prison on a technical violation, was sentenced back to prison to come up for parole in 3 years. That just didn't sit well with me. I said, he hasn't committed a new crime. He's just not following the rules. So that did not sit well for me. And then that's when I applied for the Soros Justice Fellowship and was chosen as a Soros Justice, the second person from Alabama to ever win the fellowship. And my project, of course, was probation and parole practices in Alabama. So I knew, once I landed this project, that it was going to be, something real, something that I really had to dig into. I knew that I wasn't going to get some wins right off the top because I'm in a red state, a deep conservative state, where people in Alabama and in the southern states are just unforgiving. They look at people that's, on probation or parole as people that are that are not redeemable. And so it gave me an opportunity to really like just dig deep, do research, build some relationships with, you know, people that were in legislation, try to identify those who were bipartisan, who would listen, you know, who were really, really just, you know, listening, giving individuals a chance. But bless behold, Alabama passed a bad parole bill in May of last year when a guy was released from prison after being in there 29 years, went out and he murdered like 3 people. So they passed this bad parole bill, House Bill 380, that goes back and capture individuals that have worked hard. Like it goes back from 2001 and capture those individuals. And you have to do like 15 years in prison. And it's all based off of the felonies that, you know, the class of felony. So most people in Alabama prisons are, you know, classed as violent offenders. So these, you know, you saying people have to do 15 years. So that's something that we're doing now. And this is what brought me to this work. My own pain brought me to this work. And this is why I'm digging so hard, you know, trying to mobilize family members and letting them know that, you know, this road is not easy. You know, we're going to probably win some little wins here and there, but we got to keep pressing, you know, to the mark. So since COVID hit, you know, a lot of things have been, you know, on hold. And we, you know, we still building out and strategizing to, you know, run a successful parole campaign here. So, you know, this is where I am. This is what brings me to this work, my own personal experience with my son, who is still on parole to 2021. So he's still not free. And so what I'm really looking for with, you know, with some parole reform in Alabama is those that are serving like life sentence. We put a cap on that. We also want to introduce some, you know, some legislation around giving these people earn compliant credits. You do good for 30 days, you take 30 off. And that detaches the people from being on a long period of supervision. Because when I look at what happened to Rayshard Brooks, and then when I began to just see all the videos and wondered why, you know, the incident with him happened from the police, it's because he felt fearful. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. People that's coming out probation and parole, they're already coming out of prison fearful. They have all these to-dos that they got to adhere to. So I think, you know, being a former PO and being somebody that I can sit at the table and offer up best solution, best practices is we got to meet these people where they are. You know, if a person is suffering, if you take a person off the streets and you lock them up for 20 or 30 years, they cannot come out here and function like you and I. You can't expect them to come out here and function like you and I. That's not going to happen. So I'm pushing, you know, that everybody that's released from prison on probation and parole, that they be offered some type of mental health counseling. Those that are, you know, had substance issues going into the prison that landed them to start committing crimes, that they get some substance abuse. And also even on the probation side, that when a person is placed on a period of supervision, we revisit that supervision and we wean these people off so they will not continue to be feared. And even to the part of even waiving fines and fees of those that cannot pay. So this is my experience.
Thank you so much, LaTonya. I think in everything you said, there were a few things that came up for me. I think the last thing that you said regarding to-dos, all the to-dos, and I think about, we talk a lot about barriers in reentry and we talk about barriers, but I like to think of it as the burdens, right? The burden of post incarceration, like, and also the competing demands as being part of that burden, right? Like, so you got to go see the probation officer here. You're working a 12-hour job that doesn't pay a living wage and no benefits, and then you got to show up here. So, you know, I think that is a critical point, and I think the mental health aspect, essentially what it sounds like you're saying, we need to have sort of a more holistic sort of system where it's actually a conduit for successful sort of reentry rather than an impediment that induces fear. Because the fear point is an important point to make because, again, it is the prison after the prison. People are scared for a reason, and they are free. And you said one time, you said your son is still not free. So I think probation and parole people are still not fully free. So thank you for highlighting those critical issues. So now I want to turn it over. So Tanya gave us her experience as working within the system and her own personal experience and kind of what she's doing now. Stephen here is going to tell us what's going on in California. I have just 2 guiding questions for Stephen. of what has been effective in California, but then also, what do you see as the next step and where this work needs to go?
Thank you, Quintin. California's had a crazy 10 years, and I summarized that history and gave you some key references to follow up on it if you want to in the written materials that are part of the convention materials linked to this session. Really the driving force behind changes to parole and probation over the last 10 years here has been the Supreme Court decision that required a reduction of prison population and led to legislation to try and figure out how to get that population down. And that included reforms to probation, parole, and creating 2 new forms of supervision so that we have what's called post-release community supervision for less serious felons who did time in prison. And we have mandatory release for felons who do their sentence time in jail instead of in prison. So we've got these various categories going on. That has led to some changes because the financial saving between the cost of housing someone in state prison and housing them in county jail allowed the state to distribute funds to each of the counties, which were directed to be used to support evidence-based programs in the probation and parole supervision area. So those things have come together to bring about some positive change. But I want to take some time. There are materials in the folder for you on this seminar and from the other panelists that go into different aspects of problems with parole and probation and how to reform. I thought, these days, pretty much every legislator is an attorney, but not very many lawyers know how to legislate. And almost all the reforms that can make a difference on a state basis are done through legislation. So CACJ is very proud of our legislative program. It's one of the 2 wings or arms of our efforts along with professional education. And we've had some great successes, especially over the last 10 years as the social and political attitudes toward corrections and over-incarceration have changed. For example, we drafted and sponsored a bill which established the first felony for prosecutors who intentionally withhold Brady information. We also co-sponsored a bill last year which resulted in the state is now required to pay for up to 4 years of housing for anyone who is exonerated while they're in custody. And upon their release, they get $5,000 housing allowance and up to 4 years for additional housing, along with college tuition benefits. So there are some things that can be done these days that might have been unimaginable 10 years ago, and that includes with reform of probation and parole. But how do you go about getting that legislation done? And in CACJ, we have a legislative committee, which is our most active and most attended committee. We have many members who show up for our conference call meetings. We've had the ability and benefit of being able to have a lobbyist. So we have a person who's got boots on the ground in the Capitol who's there every day. Now he has other clients, but he also has a real personal commitment to criminal justice reform. And so when something happens in the hallways at the Capitol, he hears about it or he's part of it, and he can adapt our position and contact the people who need to hear it and make things actually work. So our legislative year usually starts in October or November, and the committee meets and we try to come up with bill ideas, and then we narrow that down to maybe 4 or 5 that we think are the primary ones for the year. And our lobbyist tries to find a legislator who's willing to carry each one of those bills. We don't always succeed, but usually we do. Then the bills are all filed or recorded in their respective houses of the legislature in January and February. And then the real work of the committee starts, because our lobbyist helps pull out which bills have criminal justice implications. We usually end up with 100 to 150 bills that we pay attention to during the course of a year. And you can see the value of having a committee to help spread out some of the work for that. So our lobbyists will track which bills are going to committee hearings. In our field, it's usually the Public Safety Committee. So he keeps track 2 weeks out, what bills have been assigned to that committee, brings that information to the Legislative Committee. And we debate them, take positions, and then people volunteer to write the support or opposition letters, which are then delivered to the sponsor and the committee chair for each one of the bills. That process goes through the originating house for the bills in March and April. Then the bills that get to the floor and pass to the next house, they go through another committee process in late May and on through June. So we usually have meetings continuing and following up with positions. Sometimes there's amendments, sometimes bills just drop out. And of course, not every bill passes its committees and even gets to the floor, but we follow that process along. And in normal years, the bills are all considered in both houses by the beginning of July. There's some negotiating and adjustments and last minute arrangements that may go on into August. But then the bills go to the governor's office in September. And of course, we have developed over time some contacts with the governor's staff so that we can try and track all year long, really, how the governor's position is on a particular bill or a particular issue. And with a little luck, the bills that we support make it through the legislature to the governor's desk and get a fair consideration there. And the bills that are terrible, and of course there are probably at least an equal number of bills that are terrible as well as ones that are favorable, but the bills that are terrible, fortunately, rarely make it out of the legislature in California. So I think having a lobbyist, somebody with boots on the ground every day, that's a key component to our effectiveness. It's also the really active participation of a large number of our members, defense attorneys who are donating their time on nights and weekends to get the letters written and attend the meetings and review all the bills. So that's really the heart of our success is the volunteer members. Looking forward into, what are the next steps in California that might have the most impact on probation and parole? The last 2 years, we've had bills that were offered but have not completed the process, that were either a complete or partial elimination of the fees and charges that are imposed on every person convicted of crime in California. I know this is an issue everywhere. Ferguson, Missouri made it kind of a headline issue, and actually was probably the genesis of what has become this California reform effort. It brought to attention the terrible consequences of people carrying those fines and fees around, which lead to violations of probation and parole, where you go back into custody because you didn't have money, and all kinds of other secondary consequences. So we've had the bills in the legislature the last 2 years to try and eliminate that system where you're using the defendants to pay for the justice system, a really upside down concept, but where those bills have been there, and we're going to get them in there again next year. And if things run a little more normally next year, we may be able to get it over the finish line. We also have a bill this year which got lost in the COVID craziness, but we had a bill that would reduce the maximum time that a person could be on probation or parole. So misdemeanors, for example, will be a maximum 1 year on probation, that sort of thing. Because again, when you have this supervision period stretching out for long periods of time, minor types of misconduct or misdeeds can result in maximum consequences. And then the opportunity, which is coming up this year, and which I hope we will help turn into a bill for next year, is reducing law enforcement budgets and applying some of those savings to more resources for the post-release supervision period. We all know that when somebody gets out of jail or prison, they need housing, they need a job or education, they need food, the basics, and they need support for those things. As LaTonya said, folks, especially with longer terms, they're not coming out of there with the same ability to deal with those basic needs that you or I would have. And so if we could get some of the reforms done that lower the budget commitment to law enforcement and use some of that not just for other resources to meet those needs that law enforcement should not be addressing, like a mental health call, and get some of that added to the resources that our probation officers and parole officers have to promote that positive, supportive relationship that really should be the heart and soul of post-release supervision.
Excellent, Stephen. Thank you so much for really lifting up sort of the state level legislative reforms that are so important, in addition to sort of evidence-based programs. I always say that we can have the absolute best programming ever, but the program always ends, and then what world are we sending them out to? Are we sending folks out into a world full of barriers and fines and fees and a bunch of other bad bills, as you say? So we need both. We need quality programming, evidence-based programming, and we also need legislation to be able to address this issue comprehensively. So thank you for bringing that to the forefront. Next, we have Jessica Jackson Sloan, Chief Advocacy Officer for Reform Alliance. And the two questions that I really wanted Jessica to dive into is, how is the Reform Alliance working to reduce the number of people on probation and parole? And then what has been the most challenging aspect of this work, and anything else that you think is pertinent to this conversation? Take it away.
Great. Well, thank you for having me on, and thank you to my fellow panelists and to all those who are watching. I think, when you ask about what is reform, what are we bringing to the field, I think a big part of our purpose has been to make the issue of probation and parole sexy, right? And that's not easy to do. It's kind of a niche issue. I think it's fallen by the wayside in a lot of ways. While there's 2.2 million people who are incarcerated, there's 4.65 million people who are on probation and parole. And oftentimes that's not addressed just because, they're not behind bars and people don't feel that immediate sense of urgency. But the truth is that at any given moment, they could be back behind bars, right? And there's lots of barriers that they're encountering. Both Stephen and LaTonya did a great job laying those out. I think my wake-up call with it was, my now ex, but at the time we were together, husband came home from prison. I thought that was sort of where the terrible experience was going to end, right? Sure, he was on parole and probation. That was going to go on for a while. I didn't realize, he could be sent back and was sent back just for having a busted taillight and having a encounter with law enforcement over that busted taillight, and then not having had, his probation officer do the paperwork right. So they thought he hadn't reported. That bought him a 2-week tour from Florida up to Georgia, county to county, as he got up there and got it sorted out, right? By the time he got back, he had lost his job. He had lost his stable housing situation. There was issues with finding a new job, frankly, because of all the employment barriers to having a criminal record. So I think very much the way LaTonya was talking about the personal impact, I think sometimes with probation and parole, it really takes seeing one of these issues up front to really dive in and understand, this is an incredibly important issue and one of the, most important in the field in my mind, because mass supervision is now driving mass incarceration. And if we can't break that cycle, that revolving door that LaTonya was talking about, where you come home and, at any moment you might get returned back, not because you broke the law, right? But because you broke some arbitrary condition. I was just talking to somebody the other day who was laying out, the conditions that was put on them. And it's like, okay, he can't associate with anybody with a felony. So his brother has a felony. Which one of them is going to Christmas dinner, right? He can't leave the jurisdiction. So his child lives in the next county. Who's bringing that kid to him? He can't find work in his town, but again, he can't leave the jurisdiction. How is he going to get to work? So it's devastating for people on probation and parole. And I think reform really is bringing as much attention to that issue as we can. Obviously, COVID, threw a huge wrench in the year. We shifted for a little while and worked on some of the COVID response, some of the compassionate releases, but really a lot of compassionate releases that we went after were for people who were sitting behind bars for technical violations. A lot of the work we were doing was to stop people from being returned for technical violations while there's a plague, because every single time you're putting somebody inside of a jail or a prison right now, you might be sentencing them to death. Right? That might be sending them to their death because of the way the virus has taken off, behind bars, and the fact that it's 5 times faster accelerated than it is out here, not to mention the lack of ability to socially distance, the lack of access to hygiene items needed, the guards coming in and out, the staff coming in and out, and the lack of PPE. I mean, we donated 6.5 million masks so far into the jails and prisons, but there's still more work to be done. So I think, a big part of what we're doing is just raising awareness. We're blessed. We've got incredible people on the board. Our board chairs are Meek Mill, who went through his own probation hell. He was violated and given 2 to 4 years for basically breaking up a fight, seeking treatment for an opioid addiction stemming from getting pain pills for a shoulder surgery, and then popping a wheelie in a music video. None of that is crimes, right? That's conditions that had been placed upon him, and he had a judge that was just consistently going after him. She was really targeting him. Sadly, she's still on the bench, right? She sentenced him to community service, and he went down to a shelter and was doing his community service hours. She came down there, the judge, not the probation officer, the judge, and she got mad because he was sorting clothes in the back instead of serving food, right? Like little conditions like that. Who on earth would think that we're filling our jails and prisons with people who aren't even breaking the laws, right? So I think a big part of what we're doing is just raising awareness. Having Meek as the board co-chair really helps. Having Jay-Z on the board really helps. Having Bob Kraft, who owns a sports team and has those connections to sports teams owners, and frankly is a Republican and a very different, unlikely voice, is a big help. The other thing we're doing is we're working on state legislation. So right now we've been engaged in California. We have a coalition. Stephen mentioned the probation caps bill. That's going to be going to a vote on the Senate floor. It just got moved off the appropriations calendar and tracked straight to the Senate floor. We're really excited about that. There just was a great parole bill that we worked on that got dropped into the budget trailer that caps parole. It has a lot of exceptions. Of course, we're going to work that out in the future. And then there's another parole credits bill, which I'm really excited about because I was working on this even before I was at Reform, that creates credits for people so they're incentivized to continue to work on their rehabilitation once they come home. We've got legislation in Pennsylvania. If anybody on here is from Pennsylvania, man, I need your help. We are through the Senate. We've gotten out judiciary in the House, but Pennsylvania is a very difficult state to work in. We helped pass a bill in, thank you, I see somebody from Pennsylvania raising their hand. We helped pass a bill down in Mississippi that expands parole opportunities. We've got legislation in New Jersey, Michigan, coming up next year, Georgia, Florida, New York. So, we're really out there with the state bills. Our goal is to radically transform probation and parole to what we're calling offices of community support. They would be offices that you walk into, you're able to access, again, that coordinated entry idea, the coordinated services. You're able to access mental health support. You're able to access job placement. You're able to access financial planning and literacy classes, housing support, all of that. And, you know, if we are successful in our mission in both humanizing people who are on probation and parole, raising awareness of the issue and the fact that it's a major driver in mass incarceration, and, you know, passing legislation, we're hopeful that we'll be able to reinvest those savings into the community-based groups, and that they'll be the ones sitting in those offices of community support instead of probation and parole.
Thank you, Jessica. Really appreciate that. Yeah, I think bringing more attention to it. I like how your beginning statement was like, how do you make that sexy, quote unquote, right? And I think because people often think that sort of probation, parole, that's something, you know, like a good thing fundamentally, right? Because of the horrid conditions on the inside of jails and prisons. Of course, people could make that assumption, but you also brought another concept into this, mass supervision. And we need to really be thinking about how communities are being surveilled such that it keeps churning the mass incarceration cycle over and over again. So thank you, Jessica, for bringing those things to light. I did have one question for the whole panel. However, because of the number of questions, I'm going to flip it. So I was going to ask you all, you know, how has COVID impacted some of the work that you've been doing? However, I'm going to flip it a little bit. I'm going to go to the audience questions because there are several that we've received, and I want to be able to address as many of those as we can. And if we can get to the COVID question, we will. But I do want to address audience questions. So continue to put those in the Q&A box, but then I'll go. So LaTonya, this one is directed to you. Someone says, do you think that probation serves a purpose? Have you experienced examples of successful probationers? Or do you think the probation system is outdated or more of a trap that serves no purpose other than set people up to fail? Leading the witness there.
That's a monster question. And yes, I personally think that it's outdated. And as Jessica stated, and she laid out some great facts, we got to meet these people where they are. We got to meet the needs of the people. We got to have housing ready to go. Even if we don't have these, you know, I would love to see probation and parole offices just abolished, but that's going to take some work, okay? So what I would love to see some best practices is they bringing in, you know, some reentry people into their mix. So when you are putting on all these special conditions on individuals, it's like a one-stop shop, like Jessica said, that they can get their needs met. Somebody can be working with them with housing. Somebody can be referring them out to their mental health counseling. You can set them up for, you know, substance abuse. We need to figure out a way, and it's not a way to figure out because in Florida, we can easily write the judge and have people fines and fees converted over to community service. So it's a way to offset a whole bunch of this. But the person asked me, do I think that probation and parole is needed or probation isn't needed? I think personally that it is a trap because of all the barriers and all the special conditions that one has to meet. And as Jessica said, you know, just listening to her story about her ex-husband, a traffic light, he got, just because he had that contact with law enforcement. You know, when I think about Rashard Brooks and I think about this man lost his life because he came in contact with law enforcement. Then when I was able to go back and look at that video and put all this into context, this is why this man was trying to get away from the police, because he knew once he made that contact, he was going back to jail. He was going back to prison. So we got to really, you know, work together collaboratively on a collaboration effort. As you know, I hear Jessica talking about the legislation that they're doing. Hear Stephen talking about some things that they're doing. I would love to look at, you know, what you guys are doing to see, could I introduce some of this, you know, in Alabama. You know I live in a deep state. Jessica saying they're working over in Georgia, which is next door, you know, to Alabama. And, you know, I'm looking forward to, you know, leaning my expertise, my voices to you all. But yes, I truly think that, you know, as Vinny, I'm looking at what Vinny Sherrod said. Hey, Vinny, that yes, you know, Rayshard Brooks was, people should have just, you know, like Vinny said, people should have listened to him. He had a story. And his story was like, you know, from day to day, I'm living in fear because I got this monster on my shoulder. You know, when we was looking at mass incarceration, it was real sexy over there. That mass, you know, everybody was talking about, oh, mass incarceration. But nobody was looking at this elephant that was growing, which is, like Jessica said, is mass supervision. We have 4.6 million people that's out here on probation and parole. And at any given time, they are still not free, and they walking in traps. You know, our prison system is overhauled with people that are in prison on technical violations. You sitting in prison 2 and 3, 4 years before, and just think about if somebody have to come up for parole. They got to make parole all over again. And when you have these board members, like in Alabama, we have somebody sitting on our board that's from the Attorney General office. There's no fairness. You don't have any fairness across the board. So I think that the governor shouldn't be appointing people. It should be people in the community. It should be people like me. It should be people like Jessica. It should be people like Stephen. It should be people like us on the parole board.
For sure. Thank you so much for that, LaTonya. I think you answered that question very thoroughly. And I think that, everything that you said was just so on point, and thank you for that. These next 2 questions, I'll kind of package these for you, Stephen. One person asked, I'd love to hear about how the package offered to wrongfully incarcerated folks gets funded. And then the second question is, can you talk a little bit more about what's happening with juvenile criminal justice being moved to the Department of Health Services?
Well, on funding for the housing support, I know that that was an issue that had to be worked out in detail while the bill was moving. I don't have a clear memory of exactly whose pocket it comes out of, but it's out of the general state budget, and it was either out of the Board of Parole's budget or the corrections budget. I'm not sure which, like I say, which pocket it came out of, but it's mandated funding from the state general fund in the largest terms. And I'm sorry to say that although there's been an ongoing series of reforms about juvenile justice and the services provided to juveniles in the system or under supervision, I'm frankly not up to speed on what the current state is on those changes. So I'm afraid I can't give you anything on that.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. This one is for Jessica. Jessica, it's not exactly a softball. Have you, Jessica, I've heard the PA bill is not great and could actually make probation and parole worse. Could you comment on that, please? Thanks.
Yeah, happy to. I'm used to not taking softball, so I don't know who said that because they put their name as anonymous. But whoever it is, I also want to say you can reach right out to me. Happy to talk to you, give you more information. So I think one thing to recognize when you're doing legislation is that there's got to be a lot of strategy to it, right? So HB 1555, the House bill, wasn't a great bill. Actually made things worse. They put a provision in there that was going to allow for warrantless searches at any given point. So warrantless, I should add, suspicionless searches of people who were on probation. Now, the dynamics in the House were that we had a judiciary chair who was totally against doing any sort of probation reform. He was reluctantly at the table, but we had to get out of his committee. We took a hit. We got that bill out of the committee, got over to the Senate. In the Senate, we're able to make the bill better. Now we're back over in the House at the floor. We're looking at what amendments we can do to make that bill better. By the way, the bill that passed the Senate didn't have that warrantless search, suspicionless search provision in it. The bill got markedly better. So it's a process. And I see oftentimes groups don't really get this strategic element to it. And we saw the same thing with the First Step Act, which was a federal bill where it passed through the House. We had a hell of a time in the House. and it passed through just as prison reform. When it got to the Senate, we were able to get sentencing reform into it. Now about 14,000 people have come home federally on it. Federal system's at the lowest in over a decade, right? So this is a process. You've got to work through the process. There's a lot of strategic opposition. There's a lot of strategy that goes into this. We're hoping to make that bill even better. And again, that's why we need support from folks. So anybody in PA, looking forward to working with you on it.
Thank you. I think just lifting up the world of policy and advocacy. It is quite the dance, and certainly have to do lots of strategic negotiations in hopes that we can reach our ultimate goals as we go forward. So thanks for that, Jessica, and I hope you are taking that seriously. If you are in PA and want to connect, I think that is true. When bills are hard to get through, one of the things that helps is a lot of support from the public, and a lot of support from the community, and a lot of putting pressure on elected officials, essentially, right? And the only thing that I think can do that besides money and lobbyists is people. So definitely connect with Jessica. So another question here. I think this is for everyone. Any one of you can take this. Probation and parole reform, as opposed to things like bail reform or sentencing reform, is a little more convoluted / complex to explain, and involves systems on which uninformed people may comment they are lucky they're on probation and parole and not in prison. Why can't they behave? Why does it matter what the system is like? Because at least they're not incarcerated. How do you approach explaining parole and probation reform to people not in the know and getting them to care?
I'll tackle that the way that I, when I hear, that type of, response, like someone say, why can't they behave? Why, they lucky they on probation and parole. I equate that back to, my professional experience, because I said, no one is born a criminal. What is transpiring in these individual lives, that has them doing the things that they're doing? Is something going on there, so that led me to start trying to get to the root of the problem. Has this person been sexually assaulted? Has this person been, in and out of juvenile? Has this person dealing with a family where they've been shuffled from house to house to house because their parents were addicts? So it's a lot of challenges, and it's a lot of things that are going on with a person. We have to get to the root. We cannot continue to dehumanize and demonize individuals because we're looking at them through a lens and saying, why can't they just do what is right? It is something going on. And I will say this, I'll say this to a judge, I'll say this to whomever I have to say this to. It's something going on in this person's life. Because again, nobody is born to be a criminal. And we have to address the underlying conditions. So when you take a person from being a free person and you put them in jail or prison for a long extended period of times, and you want them to come out here and function like you and I've never been to jail or prison. Some days I have to really sit back and take a mental health break or, a self-care break to take care of myself. So I can imagine, what's going on with these individuals. I've seen that with my own son battling. I've seen my son that I raised and birthed come out of prison, not the same person, that I raised. Mental health challenges, substance abuse issues, things going on. So we got to get to the root. So that's how I address that problem. You're not walking in these people's shoes. Quit demonizing and dehumanizing individuals, and try to learn or sit at the table with these people to find out what is really going on in your life and how can I extend a hand to help you.
All right, anybody else want to chime in on that?
I would just chime in and say, in the work that, first of all, ditto on everything LaTonya said, but in the work that we've been doing, I think that the most powerful way to change people's minds is really to create empathy and to elevate the stories of people who are coming home and speaking out. And, it takes so much courage. There's so much stigma around having been incarcerated or having been justice involved, that, you know, every single one of the advocates out there talking about what they've been through is really a hero. But they've been putting it out there. So I think using our platforms to really elevate those stories, to share those stories, it really just helps create empathy. And a lot of people just don't know things like, hey, if you're late to a meeting, or if you are late on a payment, you might end up going back to jail or prison. I think that's shocking to people when you put it that way, right? When you say, when's the last time you were late making a payment? I'm late on bills all the time. Just, you know, and for me, I can do that because it doesn't put me at risk of going back to jail or prison. So I think talking about the ways that it's broken, talking about the human impact, the fact that, you know, people can come home and get their jobs stable and get their housing stable, get custody of their kids back, and then end up, you know, tripping up and having a busted taillight and ending up in prison or jail and losing all of that over there, and what that does to them. I think it can make a real difference, even with some of the naysayers.
You know, I agree with everything LaTonya and Jessica have said, and basically, I think the concept is to point out that these people are dealing with barriers and challenges that the person asking the question has probably never experienced in their life, and that if they get some support, they can get to the point where they're doing the right things. But if we leave them in a hostile environment, without a job, without a home, without any way to get food even, then we got to expect that they're going to be misbehaving.
Thank you all for that. It looks like we have enough time. We started a few minutes late, so we have enough time for a couple of more questions that we have in the chat. And then I'm going to pass it over to Monica with a couple of things. So one question is like, and this is for all the panelists again, what do you see as defenders' role? I'm assuming they mean public defenders in addressing and engaging in probation and parole reform. How can defenders help address and stem mass supervision?
One way is that, you know, legislation and public policy isn't science. So anecdotal evidence is not much good when you're doing science. You don't want to figure out how many people got COVID by anecdotal stories, but it is exactly what we need in bringing about reform of institutions like probation and parole. So the defenders are the people who can collect those stories. We are in touch with those people who have stories every single day. And when you find the story that grabs your heart, it's probably going to grab other people's too, and pass it on to your legislative efforts and your policy efforts at your county level and your state level.
And I just want to add to what Stephen said, you know, working closely, you know, with public defenders. I think that participatory defense, some type of participatory action is very necessary. When you have a community rallying around, you know, somebody that's possibly committed some type of technical violation, showing up in a courtroom, the court support, and humanizing this person. As Jessica said, you wish these people off to jail, they come out, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their dignity, they lost their home, they've lost the way of life. So I just think doing some type of participatory action and getting involved, you know, with the public defenders, you know, doing this training. And one thing I really want to say, you know, and I want to bring this to the forefront and to mention, people don't realize that POs carry heavy caseloads. And I tell people, when you have to monitor an absconder file, absconders, people that have just left supervision, you have no knowledge where they are. You have to monitor people that are in jail or prison. Then you have to monitor the people that are actively, that's on supervision. So when you think about that, you have people, POs carrying 400 plus people. That's including the absconders, the people that are in jail, that are in prison. You know, you got to keep up with all this. You got to case note all this. So I'm going to go back to what I said originally. The easiest thing for a PO to do is lock a person up. So I just think with all of us that's doing this reform, I think it's in the climate is the fertile ground is fertile where we can really get in and do some great training, you know, with officers. Because what you're going to start seeing, I didn't become a PO till I was in my 40s. But what you're going to start seeing is these young college students coming out of college with these criminal justice degrees. They have never walked in these people's shoes. You give a person a gun and a badge, and then they become powerful like Superman and Wonder Woman. So they're going to have that ego. So I think that's something that we have to interrupt and kind of get these people trained into best practices. So I'm going to go back to some type of participatory action with the public defender's office.
And I'll just chime in and say, you know, public defenders can also get involved with legislation and coming out and testifying. We saw down in California, you know, public defenders had endorsed the probation caps bill. They were key in testifying and helping push it through as far as it's gotten to. In fact, there's even another out of the Santa Clara office. You've got Jen Redding, who's a public defender, who, you know, wrote a bill with Aaron Haney here at Reform on you know, diversion for misdemeanor probation. So I think you guys have great perspective. Getting you involved in the legislation would just help us move this stuff forward immensely.
All right. Thank you, Jessica. I think we have time. So I think this is time for one more question here. And it was back to my question earlier that I was going to ask is how has COVID-19 impacted this work that you all are doing, and any other calls to action or final words you might have?
Well, here in Alabama, COVID-19 has, you know, really slowed the process down. You know, we were getting ready for session, which our session started, you know, in February, and we had, you know, I have a fellowship that I offer through my organization. It's called the Reimagine Justice Fellowship. We graduated our first cohort, and we had lobby day, and we were, you know, gearing up, working on, you know, some parole reform bills. I had pulled, you know, some bills from different states, just looking, had shared it with, you know, some of the reps, some of the senators, and, you know, got that bipartisan support. So when COVID hit, it just put a stop, you know, on everything. And then that's when the bad parole bill passed, and our governor appointed, you know, a former attorney general that's known for his bad practices, you know, lock him up and throw away the key. So we're dealing with all that. We've seen parole plummet. You know, people making parole in Alabama. You know, I think someone just sent me some stats the other day. We've had about 1,800 people go up for parole, and I think less than 300 people have made parole. You know, and the cap for a person to be set off in Alabama is 5 years. So it's just a gamut of things that we got to like pick apart, take apart, really try to get some more people introduced to the board, and just a whole array of things. So COVID has really slowed things down. We just did a caravan at the governor's mansion on the 1st, pushing back on the building of 3 new prisons, parole reform. You know, just we got one of our state representatives just in the trenches with us, just tweeting and, you know, just doing some stuff. So like Jessica said, these relationships, building these relationships are so important. You know, knowing who your allies are, knowing who, you know, you can, as Jessica and Stephen saying, getting as many people to come and testify and say why this should happen. So I think that's a shift, but, you know, COVID has really slowed a lot of things down.
So California, we saw a budget crisis that became apparent within a few weeks of the COVID thing starting up. So in order to deal with an emergency budget to address a $54 billion shortage, and the legislative sessions being shortened by taking recesses in order to prevent the spread of infection, leadership in the legislature just dropped, I think, 2/3 of the bills that had been there at the beginning of the year. The balance, you know, they've tried to fit them in here and there. The number of days for committee hearings and things were drastically reduced. So they've just tried to keep that done. The only thing that created some new opportunities and brought us some new legislation after March or so was the racial justice movement, because the legislature has picked up a number of late filed bills or late amended bills to deal with that, including potentially independent prosecutor for police misconduct and some other things. But otherwise, it's an abnormal year for sure.
Jessica?
All right, I'm a little more hopeful than you guys in terms of, you know, a silver lining here. I think one, we saw some really different partnerships. We suddenly were in alignment with groups that I never thought I would ever be in alignment with, including like the National Sheriff's Association, because they wanted to prevent outbreaks of COVID behind the bars too, right? So Correctional Leaders Association, which has always been great, National Sheriff's Association, some of the governor's offices who were looking around going, oh my God, what do we do? Please help us. We were able to get in there and kind of build those relationships, which I hope will turn into partnerships for probation parole. We're already seeing that to some extent. The other thing, and we really haven't touched on this, but one of the biggest problems with doing reform on probation and parole is the lack of data. Somebody put in the comments, you know, they're a scientist and they're appalled by how unscientific this entire field is. And that's 100% correct. There are states that we go into that I'm like, okay, well, if we get rid of technical violations of, you know, a dirty piss test and leaving the jurisdiction and being late to meeting, like how many people is that? Nobody knows. Nobody's recording, right? Like who's going back in for what, whether it's a supervision violation or a technical violation. I mean, the state of the data is unbelievably sparse. I'm hoping that in doing this, we're able to get a little bit more data collection, at least to who was being returned for technical violations, how many of those there were. I'm also hopeful because many of the governor's offices, when we showed up and said, you're going to have to release people on compassionate release, or else you're going to have like thousands of people getting sick and hundreds of people dying. They said, well, help us do it by finding the low hanging fruit. And we're like, okay, well, you should be releasing, you know, people who are elderly or medically compromised, but also technical violations. And pretty much across the board, the governors were sitting there and going, okay, yeah, technical violations, that makes sense. We also had people who stopped in office supervision check-ins. I hope that's something that continues where it's remote. You don't have to leave your job, go down there and get checked. You had a lot of people who were switched to like an administrative probation where they're not doing their monthly check-in. There was a real economic crisis. Some of that was recognized in some states where they were stopping the fines and fees payments. I hope that continues. And then of course, just stopping returning people for technical violations. I think Stephen's 100% right. You know, there are going to be local and state budgets that are in free fall right now. They're not going to be able to continue to incarcerate or supervise people at this rate. And we have to hop in there with probation and parole reforms as a cost savings program.
I love that as a way to end with some hope and possibility in the midst of some craziness. So thank you to all of the wonderful panelists. Thank you to Monica and NADCF for having us. And Monica, I'll hand it back over to you. And thank you to the audience members as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Quintin, for moderating this discussion. And thank you to the panelists just for joining us and participating in this year's conference.